Hey everyone. Today's episode is going to be a little different, and I know I've said that before, but this one is a little out of left field. This is one that Tom really wanted to do. It's not scary stories or strange things. This is more of a video essay, audio essay, however you want to look at it. So from this moment on, I'm going to transition over to the intro that Tom wrote for the script, and here we go. Hello, my friends. I would like to welcome you to what I hope to become its own kind of series, much as the Strange Things has. It's the brainchild of me, Tom K., and I just wanted to share some of the things that I'm passionate about, beyond the true crime and strange and creepy things. History is probably my biggest passion in life. There are so many amazing stories to be heard when you dive into the history of a place like ancient Greece or Rome, great empires like Persia, Assyria, places that at different points conquered the then known world. And of course, since this podcast is kind of devoted to the creepy, strange, and scary, I thought it might be interesting to share some of the darker moments in our history. I'm hoping to cover a wide range of topics here and not just center on one region or country, and I genuinely hope that you all enjoy these stories as much as I do. So let's get on to it. Historical Analysis 1. The Late Bronze Age Collapse and the Sea People. Chapter 1. The Darkening Sky. Now, indulge me a bit while I set the scene, the backdrop against which there was not a single catastrophic event, but a cascading failure of multiple civilizations in the Levant region. This was a region that was dominated by incredible powers, empires that had ruled for centuries. What could possibly happen that could bring down 4 of the greatest empires in history and leave 3 so badly diminished and weakened that they themselves didn't fully survive? In fact, all of the empires touched by the late Bronze Age collapse either fell because of it, or shortly after because of the shockwaves it created over the entire eastern Mediterranean. So step back to a time when empires still reigned supreme, with their monarchs and emperors that had carved up the known world into this delicate balance of power, made secure by trade, deep financial ties, or marriage alliances. The elite controlled the bronze, which was needed to make tools and to smith weapons and armor. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was downright foolish. Now come with me as we go back to around 1200 BCE. All across the eastern Mediterranean, a widespread drought is ravaging the great empires. Egypt's legendary granaries are nearly empty. The cities of Hattusa and Mycenae, palatial cities, starve faster than the farmers that once fed them. The Hittites are already dealing with political infighting and their court is dissolving into factions when the famine that follows the drought hits them. They were doomed. Egypt was also dealing with unrest after Ramses II's rule ended, and the power vacuum was eroding the system from within. They were trying to field massive armies abroad and a growing population at home, so again, once drought and inevitably famine hit, it emptied those granaries completely. Babylon was struggling under the pressure of their on-again, off-again ally, overlord, vassal in the north, Assyria. They were also dealing with threats in the east, where Elam was sniffing for blood in the water. In places where tensions are already high, and a disaster like drought-induced famine rocks 3 empires, the powder keg will ignite. And when it did, a panic spread and rivals no longer held back, frantic to try to loot what little the others have. Societies fracture internally as those dwindling supplies got lower and lower. In the end, neighbor turned on neighbor. Food riots would have been breaking out in Ugarit, as well as the ancient Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Byblos. Damascus's thriving markets are barren, looted for any valuables. The zoos of Nineveh were empty. Its occupants starved, possibly even consumed to feed the starving city. Even the very trade networks that had allowed all of these great powers to thrive were not as secure as the empires liked to think. In this era when bronze was king, copper was fairly plentiful. However, tin was the all-valuable and rare component. It had to be shipped in from places like Afghanistan, Iran, or Central Asia. Central Anatolia is also a possible source, but once the social and political problems started, there was no way it could have been considered a stable producer. And once it became harder and harder to source the tin, as that systemic stagnancy began to take root, well, no more tin, no more bronze. No more bronze, no more weapons. No more weapons, no more army, and so on. The social order would literally start crumbling from the inside as public order began to slip, bit by excruciating bit. But then, when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, they got much worse. Beyond the Mediterranean in the North Atlantic sits Iceland. On the south of that island lies the gateway to Hell, the volcano known as Hekla. Even now, Hekla's dangerous, still alive. Since the 9th century CE, there have been 20 major eruptions from the mouth of Hell. Clouds of ash that darken the sky for years. Streams of liquid fire gushing from the molten mantle beneath. And back in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, Hekla was even younger and more unstable. More powerful. Younger volcanoes have fewer established vents to release their pressure, and so when it finally erupts, more of the heat, ash, and magma are forced through the point of least resistance. And so not only was Hekla 1,000 years younger, but it also sits right along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, one of the most seismically active spots in the world. And this takes us to 1159 BCE. I want to pause here just for a beat, and remind everyone of the lens that we're looking through here. A combination of anthropology, geology, and archaeology tell us that these great Mediterranean empires began showing strife around 1200 BCE. So the problems were already brewing for nearly 50 years by the time we get to 1159. And remember how I said things got much worse. Okay? 1159. Iceland. Hekla. What would come to be known as the Hekla III eruption happens. Along the western Mediterranean, as well as along the Atlantic coast, you could have looked up at the sky and only just barely been able to see the sun through the haze of ash and soot that filled it. Over hundreds of miles, ash would have rained down like snow, blanketing fields, villages, and even cities. Crops would have died in the ground. Livestock would begin to starve as all the greenery suffocated under thick mounds of soot and volcanic debris. The Levant was already suffering from drought and famine, and even the eastern Mediterranean would not have been free from the climate effects, nor the social ones. People from the west began to flee their starving homelands. In desperation, they began to form their own little communities, their militias, fighting forces that were hungry with starving families. Well, if you can't farm yourself, you ask yourself, what else are we really good at? And after thinking for a moment, you remember, we're really good at building boats. And you sail east, looking for lands where maybe the sun still shines, where maybe the land isn't covered in the gray snow that kills all things. Chapter 2. The Sea People Cometh. If you were on one of the boats fleeing the devastation of Hekla, all your hopes pinned on a new start in the far east, and if you were expecting the exotic and rich land of silk, spices, and the rarest purple dye in the world, well, you were going to be disappointed. What you would have found instead was a series of lands equally ravaged by famine, plagued by war and unrest. What you would have found was ripe pickings and easy targets. If you were one of the citizens living along the eastern Mediterranean coast already starving, watching the fabric of your society beginning to fray, you would have looked out and seen black ships looming on the horizon, and you would have thought that the gods had truly abandoned your people. The boats land, and then true hell is unleashed upon your home. Cities like Pylos and Corinth are all suffering the same fate as the ones they dubbed the Sea People, set to raiding all along the Greek coast. Laconia, aka Sparta, would only skirt a direct raid by virtue of its inhospitable stance towards the sea. Go figure, Sparta being inhospitable. Athens itself would be spared the destruction by virtue of luck, maybe? It's not really clear just why Athens wasn't one of the victims of the Sea People. The sacking of Pylos was especially devastating because Pylos was one of the 3 palatial cities that dominated the Mycenaean Empire. It wasn't as well defended as the cities of Mycenae or Tiryns, but its loss was just as devastating. The cascading collapse of coastal economic centers and the often rocky relationships between cities spared pillaging destabilized the Mycenaeans so much that, between devastation in the south and seismic damage to Mycenae and Tiryns, when northern tribes, the so-called sons of Alexander, the Dacians, and the Dorians, and others, swooped in, the Mycenaean Empire, the conquerors of Troy, collapsed into history. Just to add further devastation to Greek civilization, the Cyclades were next on the agenda for the Sea People. One by one they hit them. Naxos, Paros, Santorini. None of them are well fortified. All of them flush with wealth, food, luxury goods, all vulnerable to a quick strike and fade style attack, which the Sea People were very good at by this time. What was once the gem of the Minoan civilization, Crete was not to be spared the wrath of this new Mediterranean naval power. One by one, all of the great cities and trade ports began to fall. Some of them would never recover. Even the ones that would were never the same after this era. Cyprus was ripe pickings for them. Once the mighty center of the copper trade that was just as vital as the rare tin for the creation of bronze was reduced to near nothing in the wake of the marauders. Byblos, Tyre, Ugarit, they all fell to the Sea People. Byblos and Tyre both still exist today, however. They are the longest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Even at their lowest point, there were always people calling the ancient streets home, even if they were only poor beggars and scavengers barely eking out a living. Once these cities fell, the struggling behemoth that was the Hittite Empire collapsed alongside Mycenae, into the ash pile of history. The Assyrians, too, another of the most powerful empires in the region, began to stagger under the economic collapse of Tyre and Byblos, whom they depended on for their access to maritime trade. The Assyrians were one of the empires that was shrewd enough to survive, but not for very long. They withdrew back into their heartlands and weathered the storm as best they could. Even Elam, the farthest inland empire, was rocked by the waves generated by the collapse of the all-important coastal cities. Although there was one great opportunity that presented itself to Elam during this time, the glorious city of Babylon. At the time, Babylon was languishing with the floundering Kassite rule. It mostly existed in the orbit of Assyria, although they never passed on a chance to play Elam and Assyria against each other. Elam took an opportunity and they sacked Babylon. But they didn't stop there, no. Elam and the other empires and city-states had long had a tradition in war. When they attacked and sacked a city, they would always take the statue of that city's god with them. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians would usually then just weave this new captured god into their mythology. Well, Elam took Babylon's statue of its god Marduk with them back to their capital Susa. Babylon itself survived, trudging on under various dictators and dynasties. Although, centuries later, it would once again emerge as a dominant power with the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But that, as they say, is another story. In many ways, I think it was Egypt that really stands kind of head and shoulders above the other empires at this time. You see, the Egyptians weren't altogether unfamiliar with the Sea People, or at least some of the tribes that were now part of this large marauder army/navy. Some of those tribes had actually fought alongside the Egyptians as mercenaries, and some of them had also fought against them in the same capacity. Ramses III, as pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom, wanted to live up to his predecessor and namesake, Ramses the Great. And when the black ships appeared on his horizon, sailing towards the Nile Delta, he did the only thing he could: rally every army he could muster, calling all banners for a massive pitched battle against the Sea People. The battle was brutal. The victory was costly. That cost paid in the blood of the Sea People and Egyptians alike. But, at the end, it was the Sea People fleeing while Ramses III stood victorious on the Nile Delta, watching the surviving raiders climb into their boats and sail back over the horizon from which they had come. Chapter 3: The Iron Nail. We've looked at so many events in the chain of cascading failures of the Late Bronze Age. The fragility of trade routes that fed the entire economy of the palatial cities, the likes of Mycenae and Hattusa, but also the all-important trade routes for copper and tin. The lifeblood of the bronze trade. The trade of the elite nobles and imperial families who could afford the artisan smiths that could smelt the bronze and fashion it into weapons and tools that put the world at their feet for centuries. Well, when the bronze trade collapsed, there was a vacuum that had to be filled. Everyone knew that iron was plentiful. It was literally everywhere across Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant. The problem was that iron takes a much higher heat in order to smelt it. Before the collapse, the Hittites had been experimenting with smelting and forging iron tools and weapons. They had even gifted iron weapons to some of their allies. And so here, at the end of the Bronze Age, we see the great equalizer take to the field of battle. Ironsmithing had finally started to spread, and now with this metal that was not solely under the control of wealthy merchants and imperial families, warfare was, in simple terms, democratized. Now you could either make or buy a much cheaper and more easily produced iron weapon. And while iron wasn't stronger than bronze, it was far more readily available to a larger number of people. What really pushed things heavily into the Iron Camp and made the Iron Age inevitable was when the secrets of steel were discovered. Once people figured out how to add carbon, everything changed. Iron and steel brought the final death blow to the Bronze Age empires that had ruled the world with their imperial fists for so very long. The secrets of steel would later, very famously, reach what could be considered their highest peak when Woots from India made its way west along the Silk Road and reached Damascus, where legendary smiths created a truly amazing and now lost metal, Damascus steel. Some call it the greatest metal ever smelted, and the blades it forged are the greatest ever made. It's sharp enough to slice a silk scarf, yet tough enough to cut through chainmail armor. The Crusaders feared and envied it. When they saw the smoky water markings of curved Saracen blades, they knew they were in for a long and hard battle. But I digress. Although I think I've managed to put quite a nice little bow on this one, we'll wrap it up and we can get on with our day. This leads us to the epilogue, the legacy of the Sea People. I just wanted to take a minute here to circle back around to the Sea People. They really deserve more conversation and spotlight than I was able to give them earlier in this script. Simply because stopping mid-beat to really talk about them would have completely wrecked the narrative I was trying to build. But so often, people like to just kind of say, oh, the late Bronze Age collapse was the Sea People's fault. And it's just so much more complex than that. And it completely vilifies people that were just as much victims of the ecological impact of years' worth of famine and darkness. Granted, they did become some of the most famous raiding peoples of all time. But it was the desperation that drove them to that point. We do have to take that into consideration. The environmental problems didn't just affect the Levant and Greece, it impacted all of Europe and Central Asia too. It was a pretty widespread time of hardship. And we also have to remember that one of the more famous, not necessarily as great as his predecessor perhaps, kings of Egypt immortalized the legacy of the Sea People in his battle against them on the walls of his tomb. That says they were fierce, they were worthy foes. And the Sea People didn't necessarily just vanish into the mist of time, as some of the empires that they touched did. One tribe in particular eventually found their way to the land of Canaan. The Paliset, as Ramses III called them, are said to have later become the Philistines of Old Testament fame. Maybe at the end of the day, they were the only real power that truly survived, because their legacy began at the dawn of the Bronze Age collapse, and it continued long after Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, or Assyria. And if that's not immortality, then what is? Historical analysis number 2. The Sumerian Akkadian collapse, the prototype collapse. So, we just finished talking about the wide sweeping devastation that led to and resulted from the cascading failure of empire after empire across the Mediterranean and the Levant. But what if I told you that wasn't the first time something like that had happened? It had happened before. A couple of times, actually, but the first time wasn't near as dramatic or devastating. The second time was much more fire and fury-like, but in a more localized sense than devastating an entire region for decades. Yes, there is actually a very specific prototype to the late Bronze Age collapse. The story of the Akkadian Empire is impossible to tell, though, without talking about their forebears, the Sumerians. The city builders. If not for the Sumerians perfecting the art of urban design and living, then civilizations such as Greece and Rome would never have been as impressive as they are. While Rome had its entire pantheon of gods, the true religion of Rome was that of urbanization. I digress slightly, but my point is that the Sumerians were the original cult of city building. Chapter 1. Introduction to the Sumerians. At the end of the last ice age, a group of people suddenly appeared kind of out of nowhere along the Persian Gulf, in the land between the rivers or Mesopotamia. What made this group of people so strange, so alien, was the language that they spoke. There was no other language anywhere in the region that was remotely similar to this complex dialect these newcomers spoke. Really weird. This kind of thing doesn't happen very often. Instances of language isolates are incredibly rare. They also brought something entirely new to the region: written language. With this entirely new skill or societal tool came an entirely new profession: scribe. Not everyone among the newcomers could read or write, and the ones among them definitely held elevated positions in the Sumerian society. Then came the cities: Eridu, Uruk, Umma, Lagash. Ancient centers of power, each with its own king and its own god. They built sprawling urban centers, ringed by monolithic stone walls, the images which would be passed down and made even more epic in the ages to come. Legends of strong-walled Uruk would inspire cities much later on, such as Jericho, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. This ancient civilization came into Mesopotamia and completely changed the course of its development. It brought an end to the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle with the introduction of agriculture. Once the people began to plant and cultivate grain, and they no longer had to migrate with the game and wild crops, everything changed. And Sumer began to annex and integrate the surrounding societies and tribes. But the Sumerian language, as I said, was highly complex. It was very difficult to learn to speak, read, and write. Only the most privileged were ever taught, or at least taught successfully. But this would eventually be the downfall of Sumerian society. Another language emerged spoken by the lower-class citizen, eventually the military, and over time it became the most widely spoken and written language in the region. That language was Akkadian. As the Sumerian way of life began to diminish, so too did its language and culture. Eventually, this new language would mark the beginning of a new civilization. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. As the Sumerian period began to close, the city of Ur would rise to be the center of power for a new king, one that would lay the foundations for the first known empire in human history. But it's important to take a moment here and just put this entire period into context. At this time, Stonehenge was just a series of barrows and earthworks. The monolithic stones we all know and recognize wouldn't be put in place for another millennium. The pyramids of Egypt couldn't be built for another 900 years. The last woolly mammoths were still clinging to life on the island in Siberia. The Sumerian culture that was collapsing was already ancient at this time. In fact, from the time the Sumerian civilization collapsed, going back to their origin would be comparable to us going from our current age back to the age of Julius Caesar. But when they finally collapsed, it was pretty complete. Their language was gone, but fragments of their culture, their world, echoed down to us with words and professions, such as scribe and winemaker, all brought with them from their mysterious land of origin. But in large part, the Sumerian culture was gone. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, over 1,000 years later, the final woolly mammoth on Earth lay down and died. Sumerian culture had arrived, flourished into a world-changing phenomenon, and collapsed in on itself quietly all before the last mammoth on Earth passed away. Oh, and as a little fun fact, it was the Sumerians that gave us the word barbarian, because they equated the sound of non-Sumerians speaking to that of a dog barking, thus the bar-bar-ian. Little fact I absolutely love. So, if you ever use the word barbarian, you're actually speaking Sumerian. Chapter 2. Lugal-Zaghazi, the King of the Land. In order to cue up the next part of the story, I have to do another miniature bit of context building. Sumer had never really been a unified empire, never answered to one monarch above all others. Everything was insular. Each city its own state, with an independent king and its own various subcultures. The first man to build a true land empire of any scale was the warrior king of Lagash, a man called Enadum. He was a brutal ruler, and he was the first to conquer a series of cities and integrate them in a way that we would think of as at least a small empire. By this point, the majesty of Sumer had fallen. One of its golden cities, strong-walled Iraq, had risen to prominence and hosted one of the largest populations, and was one of, if not the largest city on the planet, and then fell as other cities and kings rose. This period of Lagash being the center of power would last for a century and a half. The empire that Enadum built was fragile, however, and overextended in ways that only invited rebellion. And a man, the king of Yuma, would take that opportunity to take his own chance to build an empire. That man was Lugal-Zaghazi. Awesome name, right? Well, he was the Toyotomi Hideyoshi of the Sumerian city Umma. For the sake of Raven, I'll just call him Lugal for the rest of this. Thank you so very much, that's hard to pronounce. But Lugal began as a lowly cupbearer. From here, he worked his way up to governor of Umma, and eventually the king. But Lugal then went on to do something that no one else had ever done before. Not even the Enadum. And while Sargon the Great gets the credit for creating the first empires in history, I would argue that it was Lugal of Umma that did that. And now I will show my work. From ruling Umma, Lugal then began to conquer the other city-states of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Lagash. This, for the first time, brought most of the Sumerian cities under one banner. But Lugal's complete uprooting of the old system effectively brought an end to the old way of life, and set the stage for something far greater. He also did something that no one before him had ever done. He proclaimed himself the king of the land. Though his reign would be even shorter than the reign of Lagash and its kings, starting with the Enadum, he effectively declared the formations of the first empires ever in recorded history. Lugal-Zaghazi was the first, so get wrecked, Sargon. Chapter 3. Sargon of Akkad, aka Sargon the Great. Now, we move on to the man that most historians call the builder of the first empire in history. Obviously, we personally think that Lugal was the first, but we're only dealing with a matter of scope. That, however, is the academia stuff, and we're not here for that. We're here for a damn good story. And a damn good story it is. You see, what we have for Sargon's origin story will actually sound quite familiar to a lot of people. Centuries before the story of Moses would ever be recorded, the legend of Sargon says that a baby was born to a priestess. Due to her standing as a religious figure, she could not acknowledge that the child was hers. The baby was then placed in a basket of reeds and was set adrift along the river Euphrates. Later on, the basket was found by a humble farmer by the name of Akki. This farmer took the infant, Sargon, into his care and raised him, teaching him various practical skills the boy would need to succeed in the world. This was a secure, if humble, raising, and you could say that it went on to serve Sargon well later into life. All through his life, Sargon claimed no divine lineage. You could say that he was the first one to use the old son of a plumber line, although in this case it would have been son of a gardener. At some point, as he grew up, Sargon found himself in one of Sumer's most prosperous cities, Kish. This is where we start to see dreams of something greater beginning to show through. Now, Sargon has a very interesting parallel with Lugal. They both started as cupbearers for their respective kings. The king that Sargon found himself serving was Ir-Zababa, and I do want to clarify that being a cupbearer actually sounds less glamorous than it is. The cupbearer was often privy to sensitive information heard during private meetings with the king and his advisors. So it's probably from this that Sargon began thinking, hey, it would be good to be the king. There are stories that say that even Ir-Zababa began to fear Sargon, and after he had a dream that Sargon killed him and usurped the throne, that the king tried to have Sargon slain. Unfortunately for Sargon, the attempt failed. Now, that's not a confirmed fact, but it is an interesting bit of the story, even if it may be a healthy amount of speculation and relying on folklore to tell us what actually happened. Now, for this bit, we have a bit of a murky timeline, but it would seem that during a conflict between Ir-Zababa and Lugal-Zaghazi, that Sargon capitalized on a chance. Along the way, Sargon had built a coalition of other Akkadian-speaking people, and he rose up in rebellion against Ir-Zababa. And after triumphing there, he turned his sights to Lugal, the other undisputed power in the region at the time. Chapter 4. The First Empire. At this point, Sargon of Kish had his sights on the big bad of the period. The man that, like him, had risen from humble origins to a king, Lugal-Zaghazi. The battle did not end well for Lugal. Sargon had gathered up the following of Akkadian-speaking men, and he went to war with Lugal, and he toppled the self-proclaimed king of the land, and he humbled him, taking him to one of the most spiritually important cities in Mesopotamia at the time, the city of Enlil himself, Nippur. Lugal was paraded to the city in chains and presented as an offering to the king of the gods himself, the god that the Sumerians said created the world, and was the god of the air. In less than 20 years, Lugal-Zaghazi had gone from unifier to humbled prisoner of war. From here, Sargon would systematically raise the magnificent walls of Uruk and other cities, including Yuma, Lagash, itself having already been ravaged by Lugal-Zaghazi as retribution for what Lagash and Eannatum had done to Yuma a century before, Ur and other strongholds of Sumerian culture. This was both incredibly symbolic and very strategic. It was symbolic as he wiped away the last vestiges of Sumerian security. The walls that had protected their way of life for centuries were now gone. It also ensured that no one from those strong-walled cities would ever be able to rise up and challenge him. Much like Hideyoshi, Sargon greased the rungs of the ladder, making it impossible for anyone else to ever do what he had done. What Lugal-Zaghazi had conquered, Sargon now consolidated and built upon. Having destroyed the walls of the ancient seats of power, the cities of gods and men, the new king of the land built his own city. This city was Akkad, or Agade, but for this script we'll refer to it as Akkad. And what makes this city so fascinating is we have no idea where it was, or where the ruins of it might be. Some speculate that it could be north of the traditional Sumerian heartlands, possibly between Kish and Babylon. By building this new city, this new gem in the land between the rivers, Sargon was officially declaring that the age of the Sumerians was over, and their civilization as ruined as the once mighty walls of their greatest cities. And while the location of Akkad remains one of the great mysteries of archaeology, the effect it had on the region would live on long after it had vanished. The scribes of later times refer to Akkad as the city of kingship. This set a standard that kings of later empires, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, would follow. Even in the age of Assyria, many kings did this, starting with their most sacred city, bearing the name of their patron god that would go on to supplant the mighty Enlil Ashur. Later on, the city of Nimrud would be elevated to the city of Assyrian might, and even later still, an entirely new city would be built by Sargon II of Assyria, called Dur-Sharrukin. Sargon was so inspirational that later on the king of another great empire would take his name. That is how influential Sargon the Great ended up being. Nearly 2,000 years after his rule, he was inspiring other men and other kings. Something else Sargon the Great was the first to do was that he formed and maintained the first standing army, the Sons of Akkad. It was over 5,000 men strong. Until this point, armies had been seasonal levies. Wars could only be fought in narrow campaign seasons that usually started just after the planting in spring and before harvest came in the cold winter after. For the people of this ancient world, this presented a bit of a problem. If you marched your sizable but seasonable force to a city, and they just went behind the walls and locked the gates, and you couldn't break the gates quickly enough, you would have to turn around and march back home. Sargon changed all of that. Imagine the first walled cities he marched upon. They lock their gate and stand on their walls and just wait for the Akkadians to break camp and go home to work their fields. But then the campaign season ends and the Akkadians are showing no signs of leaving. That must have been terrifying for the citizens that dwelled within the cities that Sargon aimed to conquer. Elsewhere in the world, the Indus Valley civilization was at its peak. The city of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't the ghostly graveyard that we know today. It was a thriving urban center that had direct trade with Mesopotamia. While Sargon was building his empire, Indus ships were probably sailing into ports along the Persian Gulf, as Indus seals have been found at several Mesopotamian sites. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid is now 200 years old, and the Old Kingdom is still flourishing. For the pharaoh Pepi I, the monument built to Khufu was already becoming ancient. Meanwhile, in China, they were building their first walled cities, but were still centuries from the first dynasties that would be so famous in later millennia. While Sargon was smashing the walls of the old world of Mesopotamia, in Britain they were dragging the massive stones that would complete Stonehenge. They were just coming out of a Neolithic age, and the use of early bronze tools was spreading, marking the very early stages of the Bronze Age in the very early United Kingdom. Chapter 5. Ruin. Sargon would rule for about 50 years, and then his son, Ramush, would rule through blood and violence. Sumerian cities that had never been accepting of Akkadian rule began to rise up, and Ramush answered the way any man of power in Mesopotamia would, with blood and fury. Tens of thousands are said to have been killed in the cities of Umma, Ur, and Lagash. Despite his gusto in suppressing the dissidents, Ramush himself would be assassinated in the kind of court intrigue and conspiracy that would make Brutus proud. This puts another of Sargon's son, Manishtushu, on the throne. He was more of a builder than a warrior. That's not to say he didn't have his military successes, of course, but his reforms and building projects would earn him enemies of his own. And like Ramush, he would be the victim of a court intrigue and was also assassinated. At this point, the question's beginning to take root. Akkad is conquered, now can it rule? It was now the turn of one of the most famous of Akkadian kings to try and answer this question. Naram Sin, another really cool name I think, came to power as the grandson of Sargon the Great. Naram Sin, the man who audaciously proclaimed himself king of the four quarters of the world, would push the empire to its greatest reach into Anatolia, Syria, and Elam. His success marked the true golden age of the Akkadian Empire. But as with so many civilizations across the world at any given time, once it peaked, it immediately began to decline. Do you recall how Lugal proclaimed himself to be king of the land, only to be ousted by Sargon? Well, in a rather ironic mirror of that hubris, Naram Sin would proclaim himself a god. Many people would later say that it was this arrogance in the face of the old gods that started Akkad's decline. The later years of Naram Sin would be plagued by chaos. The 4.2 kilo years drought hit the region and crops failed. Not only Mesopotamia felt this particular event. Even the Indus Valley began to wobble. Fractures in the old kingdom of Egypt were beginning to appear as well. Naram Sin's son, Shar-Kali-Shari, inherited this chaos. As fractures in Akkad's invincible facade began to show, one of the region's most feared enemies, one described as wild mountain dragons, the Gushans began to harass and cause problems all over Akkad. Sumer was in full-on revolt, and Shar-Kali-Shari was destined to spend his entire reign fighting fires on every front. And we're in a massive drought, so those fires are really hard to put out. We'll never know just what kind of king Shar-Kali-Shari could have been, as the majority of his reign was spent trying to bring the empire back to heel and fighting off the barbarians of the Zagros Mountains. And after his death, all of his efforts crumbled beside the empire he had tried so desperately to save. After he died, the empire fragmented. The Gushans gutted most of the empire's carcass and dominated the region for nearly a century. The drought persisted, and the Akkadian cities dwindled in population. And their most sacred city, the one that symbolized its might and dreams of dominance, vanished completely into the mists of time, taking with it the hope of kings and god-kings alike. Akkad ruled for 180 years before it collapsed, and the next 80 years would be Mesopotamia's own Dark Age as Gushan tribes ran roughshed over the land and between the rivers. Then, the light of a new age began to dawn. The Sumerian culture wasn't quite done just yet. It would have another golden age when the the Third period dawned. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. All right. I know this was a long one, and possibly not for some listeners, but to those of you that stuck with it and enjoyed this little experiment, we would like to say thank you so much for listening. And from Tom, thank you to Raven for letting me have the chance to write this and kind of try something a bit different. You're very welcome, Tom. I do appreciate you, man. This was an interesting project that, while I was initially kind of iffy on it, there came a point where I started thinking about it and kind of just said, you know what, just do it. Just full send. We're trying new things, and this isn't necessarily something that's going to become a constant thing. And I know I've said that about other things, and I was right about those. They haven't become constant things. This is something that I wanted to go ahead and just give it a shot, see what happens, see how it goes, and let Tom release some of his creative ideas. So, we do hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have some ideas for other similarly themed projects, please do let us know, as always. If you're on the YouTube side of things, please do consider subscribing and commenting with your thoughts, liking the video, etc. If you're on the podcast side of things, consider rating the podcast, subscribing if there's a subscriber follow option, and if you're on Spotify, leave a comment with your thoughts as well. Also, If you have a scary story you'd like to send in to the podcast, go to astheravendreams.com, click the button to send it my way, or you can always email it to astheravendreams@gmail.com. All that said, my friends, I hope you have a beautiful week and a beautiful rest of your month, year, decade, whatever. I hope I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember that you are loved, you are valid, you are important, and you are the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Until next time, much love, and sleep well.